Today, I want to talk about my top 10 Seinfeld episodes. Seinfeld, if you're somehow unfamiliar, is a sitcom that took place in the 1990s. And basically, my criteria for this list is which episodes made me laugh the most. It is a sitcom. So that's basically the whole goal of the show. So at number 10, I'm starting with The Hamptons, a season 5 episode that takes place in the Hamptons, of course. This is a little getaway for our main group of characters, Jerry, George, Kramer, and Elaine, and a lot of stuff goes down while they're here. The first of many things is that George's girlfriend ends up laying outside and tanning topless while he isn't there, so strangely enough, his best friend end up seeing her without her top on before he does. And from there on, it feels like a snowball of ridiculous events that occur. George is seen coming out of the pool by Jerry's girlfriend, and she ends up seeing him naked, and he doesn't like what she saw. Kramer ends up stealing lobsters from this commercial lobster trap out in the ocean, but he just ends up taking it, not thinking twice about it. Many of these events that are going on in the house create high tensions when the group comes to eat meals, and it just makes for really funny scenes. I definitely think George is at peak form in this episode as he gets extremely upset and paranoid and vengeful as he does sometimes. This episode is truly hilarious. At number 9, I have The Merv Griffin Show, a season 9 episode. This episode centers around two things: the absurdity of Kramer and Jerry and George kind of taking advantage of his girlfriend's toy collection. Once again, another ridiculous plot of an episode from Seinfeld, but it just shows how quirky and funny these characters are. Jerry's favorite part about his relationship becomes playing with his girlfriend's toy set when he's over at her place after she falls asleep. And it got to the point where he was like force feeding her wine and turkey in hopes that she would fall asleep so that he and George could play with the toys she had there, which obviously is a little messed up, but that's just the way these characters are. Kramer surprisingly finds the old set of The Merv Griffin Show in a nearby dumpster and rebuilds it in his living room in classic Kramer fashion. And him living in his normal fantasy world continues to play this up as if it is actually the Merv Griffin Show and brings on all of his friends and these random people to tell funny stories, even though there's no real camera and nobody's actually watching them. Kramer's, a bit wacko. And the episode comes to a hilarious conclusion, though it's very unfortunate for Jerry because Kramer brings on the girlfriend that now knows Jerry took advantage of her to play with her toys. So it created a very awkward situation. And the whole thing is awkward to begin with because it's not even a real TV show. And then, Kramer's reacting to this stuff as if it's actually happening live on TV and he has to play it up for the crowd. So it creates a really funny scenario. And this is one of my favorite episodes from the last two seasons of the show, where Larry David was no longer writing for the show, of course. At 8, I have The Junior Mint, a season 4 episode. To summarize, Elaine visits an ex-boyfriend that she feels bad for in the hospital. She was really just going there to show her sympathies, but she ends up kind of starting to like him again because apparently, because of his medical condition or whatever was wrong with him, he ended up losing weight and, in her eyes, becoming more attractive again. She thought he was a little overweight before, apparently, but now she's like real interested in him. And eventually, all of the friends end up in that hospital room, and Kramer finds out that he's going to be getting the surgery that he was watching on a TV show recently. Now, Kramer wants to witness the surgery as the doctor offers, and he asks Jerry to come with him. Jerry reluctantly accepts, and eventually, Jerry and Kramer go to watch the procedure. Hence the name of the episode. Kramer brings Junior mints and is eating them while the procedure is going on, and he offers one to Jerry. Jerry continually says no, but Kramer tries to push them on him, and so Jerry kind of pushes it away from him. The Junior mint ends up going flying out of the box or out of Kramer's hand and right into the body of the guy that Elaine likes. And the doctors kind of look around because they hear a little plunk noise, but they don't actually know what happens, and they continue to sew up the patient with the Junior Mint still inside. So the fallout from this event is what carries the rest of the episode, and of course it's just once again the word that keeps popping in my mind is ridiculous, these things that they get themselves into. But, the dialogue surrounding this, the rest of the episode, and how they're worried about the consequences is hilarious. At number 7, I have The Frogger, a season 9 episode, and I have it on this list as my favorite post Larry David era episode. The Frogger is really centered around my favorite character, George. The actual Frogger is a game that George has the high score on from when George and Jerry used to go there in their college days. He would play on it, and it turns out that he still has the high score on this machine. And now that the restaurant is closing, he wants to preserve the Frogger, hence preserving his record on this machine and take it home with him. Well, there's a lot that needs to go into this because he needs to keep it plugged in, or else the game will lose all of its memory and his high score will be gone forever. So he ends up getting hooked up by Kramer with kind of a shady crew, including Slippery Pete, who is apparently Kramer's main man to go to in a situation like this. And as it turns out, George's plan really doesn't work. He ends up trying to cross the street with it, and it ends up getting destroyed by a truck. So, unfortunately, George didn't get to keep the Frogger with the high score. There's some super funny dialogue in this episode between Kramer and Slippery Pete, and George just getting mad at everybody in the situation. Slippery Pete was supposed to be an expert in this, and he didn't even know the term outlet. He just called them holes, and George really got frustrated with him at many points. Also, the side plot in this episode of Jerry being scared of the Lopper, where his girlfriend lives, and that preventing him from breaking up with her, kind of prolonging their relationship a little bit. He really didn't want to leave because he was hearing about this Lopper that Kramer claimed was cutting people's heads off. So, pretty funny episode all around, and one in the last season that I really enjoy. At number 6, I have The Contest, a season 4 episode that was pretty groundbreaking for this show. I think Seinfeld already had good success before this, but I think this episode made the show extremely successful and probably the biggest at its time. Now, the plot of this episode is a bit inappropriate. The four main characters, after some discussion about what happened with George and his mother catching him doing something, have a conversation and end up placing bets and having a competition on who can go the longest without pleasuring themselves, I guess you could call it. And of course, because the Seinfeld writing is just so good, they're all put into scenarios where it becomes even harder than normal for them to refrain from these activities. There ends up being a naked woman across the street that both Jerry and Kramer can see from their rooms. And Elaine ends up getting the hots for RFK Jr., who she hears is really into her and kind of wants to go out with her. I know Kramer is the first to get out because of the distraction across the street, and Elaine follows him because of her situation not too long after, and George is the ultimate winner of the contest. But yeah, it's just an extremely funny and important episode in the history of this show, one that really caught the attention of the public eye. At number 5 is The Ticket, a season 4 episode, and for big Seinfeld fans, this would probably be the most out of the ballpark pick that I have on here and the biggest surprise. However, I really have always just loved this episode from the first time I saw it. I think Kramer is absolutely hilarious in this episode. His physical acting is on point per usual, but it's especially exaggerated in this episode. And the main plot of this episode is that Kramer agrees to be the alibi for Newman's trial on a speeding ticket. From early on in the episode, Kramer's acting a little off. It appears that he has some concussion-like symptoms and short-term memory loss. And it seems like in the trial, he's acting pretty normal a lot of the time leading up to it. But when it's his turn to defend Newman and confirm the claims that Newman makes about what he was doing and why he was driving so fast, Kramer fails to remember the story that they came up with, and Newman goes into a state of insanity. He is completely flabbergasted that Kramer doesn't remember what they just talked about a few minutes before coming into the courtroom, and Newman and Kramer are just really funny yelling at each other. This is also the episode where Jerry and George get their offer from NBC for their pilot, and they're offered, I believe, $13,000 or $11,000 between the two of them. And George is insulted by whatever the figure is, and he references Ted Danson and how much he makes. And basically everybody, anytime that's brought up, makes fun of him because they're nowhere near Ted Danson's level. In addition to all the other hectic things going on in this episode, while George and Jerry are at the coffee shop, they believe they see Crazy Joe Davola out the window. So Jerry goes to the counter and asks a police officer there having coffee if he can walk them out when he's ready. And then George and Jerry continue to be frustrated with how long the police officer is taking to finish his coffee and how much food he keeps ordering. And it just points out some of the flaws in our characters, but the flaws that as viewers we're able to love, even though realistically they're being very impatient and inconsiderate people at some times, but it makes for really good comedy. At number 4, I have a season 5 episode, The Opposite. A lot of my favorite episodes are George centric episodes, which you've seen so far and you're especially going to see moving forward. Basically, all of my remaining ones are centered around George specifically. And the basis of this episode is George kind of turning away from his usual habits and what he would normally think to do in a situation and choosing to do the complete opposite because his life is essentially a failure in his eyes up to this point. So if he does the opposite of whatever he thinks intuitively, maybe that will lead him to better things and to make the right decisions. And with a great streak of luck, this actually does turn out to do really well for him, and he starts falling into some great situations and getting the attention of girls and what have you. This episode also has a really funny premise with the fact that George is on the rise. Elaine begins like a decline throughout this episode. She loses her job. A bunch of bad things are happening in her life. And Jerry, kind of the even keeled guy who never really worries about anything. You know, you have George and Elaine who always kind of seem to be very anxious about all these situations, whereas Jerry's kind of the more cool, calm, and collected one throughout the show. And in this episode, they show that because he's the one that always breaks even. They bring this to our attention in many ways. Not only in real life does he break even, just kind of luck wise and what have you, but they even have him like playing games of poker. And at the end, he'll be saying he breaks even. He loses $20. He finds $20 on the street. So many examples of that come up throughout the episode. And I think it kind of goes along with the personalities of their characters as well. In this episode, Kramer's coffee table is getting published and he's going on tours as well. So there's a lot of funny moments with that. Kramer really loves his coffee books and creates some hilarious scenes with some of the mishaps he has along the way of promoting it. At number 3, I have a season 7 episode, The Calzone. This one also might not be like one of the most critically acclaimed or one that you think of when you think of Seinfeld, like some of the ones I already have mentioned have been. But the Calzone is super hilarious. Once again, I think George probably gets the most screen time in this episode, and he really delivers. A lot of his action is going on at work, or at least related to work, because the premise of this episode is that he brings a calzone to work every day so that he can kind of have an in with his boss, because his boss really falls in love with these calzones from Paisanos, I believe it's called. And so George continues to get these calzones every day for lunch to get on the good side of his boss, George Steinbrenner, who's known to be kind of a nut. And eventually George gets banned from Paisanos because he doesn't really steal out of the tip jar. He leaves a tip, but he was feeling bad in typical George fashion, bad for himself because he left a tip, so he's losing money, and the person didn't even notice that he was the one that left it in there. So he wanted to take it out and put it back in when the employee was working to get credit for the tip. Which, if you're thinking realistically, if you're going to be a generous person, you should do it, not so that people see you or so that you get notoriety for it. You should just do it out of the kindness of your heart. But George is flawed, and so he tried to get the money back and do it again, and it turned out poorly for him. He gets kicked out of here. So from now moving forward, he has to turn to alternate ways to acquire these calzones from this restaurant, which brings Kramer into the equation and Newman into the equation, and funny things happen with them there. Kramer, I believe, also gets kicked out because he has the guy dry his clothes in the pizza ovens there, and he also tries to pay in like pennies and all coins. So they got frustrated with him and kicked him out as well. So a lot of bad stuff happens for George in this episode, and it's just really hilarious his interactions with George Steinbrenner the whole time as well. At number 2, I have The Fire, a season 5 episode that I absolutely love. I think this episode has some of the funniest dialogue between Jerry and George in the entire show. And once again, George is the most involved in the main event of the episode, which is at his girlfriend's son's birthday party. And there ends up being a fire in the oven, and he has this dispute with the clown there, and he ends up knocking a lot of people over running away from the fire. And it creates, like I said earlier, a lot of funny dialogue at the coffee shop between Jerry and George. Probably my favorite back and forth moment from them in the entirety of the show. So that's why I have this so high. That scene really sticks out to me. And also George trying to defend his actions throughout the duration of the episode as if he was in the right, which once again, per usual, George was in the wrong and being pretty selfish uh, in the situation of the fire. Also in this episode, Kramer has like equally as wacko of a girlfriend as he is, and she comes with him to Jerry's comedy act, and she ends up kind of heckling him and disliking some of his jokes. And then as payback, Jerry goes to her workplace and heckles her. There's a hilarious fallout from this, though, as she runs out onto the street being really upset and gets her pinky toe cut off by a street sweeper. And Kramer has a hilarious story in which he recovers the pinky toe and gets it to her at the hospital in time for it to be put back in its place. And yeah, the bus ride that he had over was like a legendary character defining moment for Kramer, I think. And I think it kind of flies under the radar. I'm talking about this episode as a whole, but there's really so many amazing moments with George, with Kramer, even with Jerry kind of talking to both of them. I think it's a spectacular episode, one that I don't hear as like one of the classics, but for me, it is a classic. It's so hilarious. At number one, I had to go with one that I felt is like one of my personal favorites and is also like one of the staples of the show, and that's the marine biologist, which happens in season 5. So 3 of my top 4 episodes were in season 5 actually, which surprised me because I think I like episodes at all different points of the show, but it just turned out a lot of my very favorites are in season 5. So I guess for me, this is the peak of the show here in season 5. The marine biologist centers around George once again, pretending to be a marine biologist, even though his go-to profession to fake is usually as an architect. But Jerry kind of choked in the situation of seeing one of George's old friends and told her that he's a marine biologist instead. So in typical George fashion, he chooses to lie instead of going with perhaps the easier option, but maybe a little embarrassing for him, telling her his real job and his real status in life. Instead, he ends up trying to do a little bit of research to act like he knows stuff about being a marine biologist. And eventually that plan goes awry because he's on a date with her as they're walking on the beach, and a whale is like washed up on shore, and people look to him to save the whale. In the end, he actually does end up saving the whale, and it ends up that the obstruction the whale had was in its blowhole, and it was a golf ball that Kramer had previously hit earlier in the episode because he was talking about how he went and hit golf balls on the beach. And then this whale that George had to end up saving had the golf ball in its blowhole, which it's like one of the most well-written episodes because I love it. Had the typical Seinfeld formula where they bring up this minor detail early in an episode, like Kramer hitting golf balls at the beach. Like you don't think much of it. It's funny how Kramer delivers it and everything, but then it ends up actually being huge to the plot at the end of the episode. They do that a lot of times, and this is arguably my favorite way that they intertwine the different points of the plot. I thought it was brilliantly funny, of course, and George delivers his speech of how it all went down perfectly at the end. And actually, after this, I was kind of proud of George because he ends up telling her that he isn't actually a marine biologist, maybe thinking that since he saved the whale anyway, it would kind of soften the blow of the situation. And she'd say, well, that's okay because you saved the whale. But too bad for George. She was kind of disgusted with him that he would lie about something like that. So she was done with him. And the only thing he really got out of it was a lot of recognition for saving the whale. He was in the newspaper, but he lost the girl that he really liked. So that's unfortunate. But yeah, arguably the funniest, most well written episode from a plot standpoint and a humor standpoint, and arguably the most iconic episode, definitely like in the top 3. So that is what all made this my favorite episode in Seinfeld history. Thanks everyone for watching. Let me know what your favorite Seinfeld episode is in the comments. I'm only 20 years old and I watch Seinfeld all the time. I feel like that's a little abnormal, but I really find that a lot of the humor and things that go on in the show, at least the themes, are transferable even to modern day. Even though, a lot of the technological stuff is obviously outdated at this point, I do think, like I said, a lot of the themes and the things the characters go through in life, the challenges they face, are still relevant today. Like this video and subscribe if you enjoyed. I'll have more Seinfeld content and content on other shows and movies on my channel in the future. This is Ty the TV Guy, and I'll see you next time.